year is very crazy for everyone. All holiday parties and preparations and things. And I thought I would use my time here today actually going around and what better crowd than to ask what technology gifts we should be buying. So can we all line up the microphones and work our way through that? No, I thank you for coming out and really looking forward to this time to kind of get to know me a little bit about where I come from and what I've done. Mary gave you a little bit of my history. I was working upstairs at USAID for just a couple months, helping them get some digital things happening and starting to help kind of connect Americans with the business of international development. And before that, in the administration, spent a couple years at the Federal Communications Commission. But I thought, from a historical standpoint, I'd actually take you back a little bit further. And I entitled this discussion with us today, Our Moment. Because I think there's actually a lot of moments where our country sort of needs a partnership between all of you, the community on the outside of government, and those of us inside government to really transform things. You know, one of the ones I'll take you back to was in the 1980s. When I was a kid, growing up in the Midwest, I grew up in Iowa, I remember vividly in the early 80s, lots of innovation happening in Japan. There were videos of Japanese business people doing workouts before work. There was all this talk about quality control. You know, Sony, Honda, Toyota were all doing, and nothing against it, they were doing amazing work. But the narrative that was happening in the U.S. following the 1970s recession and all that was that our best days were behind us. That we were destined to be a society of, and no offense to anyone in the room, management consultants and burger flippers. We were the services economy, and so, you know, what was happening kind of at that time, you know, in that narrative, you know, lots of things were going on sort of behind the scenes. There was incredible work happening in government. You know, ARPANET was being stood up kind of from the 60s on throughout all this time. There was a lot of focus on fundamental research. You know, I gave during ELC, I was out at Xerox PARC in Palo Alto, one of the nexus of lots of primary research and things that were happening on this. And there were lots of people focused on, you know, science and technology education and sort of this emergence of a new American business model. And during that time, you know, we hit an inflection point where the need we had in the country was answered by a group of, you know, young startups that really kind of came to call, as well as big businesses that sort of changed their models and moved forward. And it gave birth to the PC revolution and the personal computing revolution that we now sort of take for granted today. All of us, I mean, many of you have a computer in your pocket that was more powerful than things we did back then. And speaking of things back then, here's a picture of me opening up my first computer. This holiday season, look at that haircut. And there I expanded out. You can see me, I instantly jumped in to start reading the manual. I know a percentage of the crowd here is government, so if there's any DOD, I want you to notice those cool camo pants I've got on. Even back then, I was working with you. The other thing I did at that time, in 8th grade, I was programming BASIC on an Apple IIb computer, and just spending, you know, locking myself in my room for weeks, programming this Commodore 64, spending all this time in the computer lab at school writing this. And one of the fun things that came from that was, you notice that little formula down at the bottom, which is a stab at some BASIC that I wrote last night. I don't really remember all of it, but it's one of the apps that I wrote during that time was a name parser that would go through all the list of students and figure out what was their first name and what was their last name. And we had lots of Mary Anns and other things in our school, and so my formula started at the right-hand side and worked left, and it would look for the space in the name and assume everything that it found before the space was the last name. And amazingly, my name was the one where it broke. And so when I met my wife, you know, about 10 years ago, and we got married, I legally had the space removed from my name, and which I did back then too, but I officially had it done. So I'm not a geek and into technology. My children and my children's children and everyone henceforth in my family will be named because of a debug of the basic program. That may be sad or a really good thing. Now, the other thing that was happening was sort of seizing on this moment in thinking about how are we now in our own moment? How is that shaped from the perspective of the U.S. government? And I'm going to show you a couple pictures that I actually use inside the halls of government, mostly on the Hill and with others around government. And the first picture is of a cabinet meeting, and you can see around the room there's lots of coffee cups and some paper and things like that. It's an very important group of people getting together and meeting. But what's typical about this is this sort of looks like a meeting in government. It's one that you go in through any federal building and walk in. You'll typically see conference rooms of meetings like this. When I left the private sector a couple of years ago, meeting rooms looked like that. And thinking about what and I actually cropped this photo. There's actually a wireless router at the top of the picture. You can't see in this crop, but there's people with laptops. There's people throwing stuff up on the screens. There's lots of interactivity when information's needed. They can pull it up, and you can in real time kind of collaborate and work through problems. And I use these pictures in government to talk to people about, are we ready? Are we drawing a line between these two pictures? Because the thing we have to all sort of grasp is that the picture on the right is what's coming. These are young students in this photograph, but they are the next business owners, the next Congress people, the next federal employees, the next war fighters, the next taxpayers of the future. And those people are going to expect more from their government, both working in it and interacting with it, than we are drawing a line to drive. And so a lot of how we need to think about this is not only are we fostering it, but also are other countries doing this stuff? Are other countries embracing technology in a way that will be fundamental and take that forward? Now, when I think about this phenomenon's been happening probably for the last 5 years or so, where wireless has been pervasive, laptops outpaced PC sales, and you're starting to see that in the workplace. People kind of carry those things around. And it's definitely the consumerization of technology with smartphones and tablet devices being brought into the workplace and things like that, all happening within sort of the last 5 years. And so why didn't the government sort of 5 years ago sort of jump on this? Well, I think we didn't at the time have a president that sort of embraced this so fundamentally like our president does now. We didn't have a chief information officer sort of looking over the government, thinking about how do we do these things, how do we pick out the best things happening in these places and push those. And I think the pressures weren't the same as they are today. If you go through the pressures on federal IT, what's pushing federal IT? One, of course, is, and one of the biggest ones is cybersecurity. Never before have we had the pressures of cybersecurity like they exist today, and this is ever increasing. So the pressure for us to be ever vigilant and to balance cybersecurity against other demands on the federal portfolio is really great. Another, of course, is the fiscal pressure. This is the kind of the one I don't think we have to discuss very much because everyone knows a lot about. We have an imperative to find ways to save money, to be more efficient, to spend less, and to do things in a different way. We have the Facebook nation. When I showed you that picture, you sort of make the assumption, and we all, I'm sure many of you have given talks, places, and things talking about the internet generation or the digital natives or people that sort of in their mid-20s right now who grew up online, who are very familiar with technology and what technology does in their lives. I think what we hadn't anticipated was the effect of social media. You now have 80-year-olds who are getting on Facebook and embarrassing their grandkids. sunk cost calculations in your businesses every day, thinking about, do I make the risk trade-off of kind of respecting where I've spent in the past and building on that, or do I go and do something new? And when you draw the pie chart and think about IT values and the strategic nature of IT in your organization, you often draw multiple pie slices. One is sort of maintaining the old, which is slightly probably more than half of what you do in an IT spend. There's a pie slice that is sort of delivering new value to your organization from an IT perspective. And then in private sector, there's often a pie slice that says depreciation. You think about, how do I sort of land the plane on stuff that I've invested in the past and have this sort of spirit of churn that produces new value. We kind of do two things in government. One is we don't have a spirit of depreciation. And the other thing is we have such a reliance on sunk costs that we sort of chew the new value, deliver new value pie slice down to almost nothing. And so you have so much of the spend goes into a mentality of, well, I've always spent that way, and so I'll just spend that way in the future. When we really need to bring a new perspective. Think about how do we take, say, about 15% or so of old maintenance cost and turn that into new value and have a cut and invest strategy kind of across the federal portfolio. And that's something we're actually starting to see in some of the agencies because of these pressures that are applied. And then the last one is U.S. leadership, ensuring that everything we do, from the way we spend and the way we do manage the federal IT portfolio, that we always do it with an eye towards U.S. leadership. There's a great conversation there is on cloud, and thinking about all the trade implications and data sovereignty and things like that. We need to make decisions in such a way that we respect and build on the great work that happens. The America is still the center of excellence for IT technology, and we need to kind of keep fostering that in the way that we as a government buy and the policies we set on how to implement this stuff. And so we have a big imperative to think about that as well across all these pressures. Well, given these pressures, given that this is our moment and how, and seizing on that opportunity to pull into there, I thought I'd take you through quickly sort of some of my priorities given all this. And these are broad sweeping. There's lots of things that come through all of this going forward. The first priority is really kind of maximizing ROI of federal IT and thinking about how do we do more with less. And this is something I've actually challenged my team and the CIOs across government to do. And that is, I think we sometimes get caught up in just talking about the less. How many data centers did we close? How much money did we save here or there? Did we run a Textat and sort of kill a program and things like that? I think it's equally as important to also give the message of what we're doing from the more perspective, and always couple more with less. So if we go out talking about something great we've done, how do we do that great thing in a more efficient way? If we talk about less, we've closed data centers, we've saved some money here or there. What's the thing that's going to be better because of it? Are we providing better service to Americans? Are we driving more value into the work we do in government and kind of connecting the dots on that? And so you should hear from us as we come out with talking about technology and what we're doing, really kind of it under this notion of do more with less and how we're going to get that. We're going to get more with less. It also helps us on the Hill to get people to understand what technology can do and how those things can happen in a way that can be beneficial to everyone by deploying new technology and doing it in a different way. The second one is thinking about the productivity gap in 21st century government. We as a government just haven't kept pace with the private sector, and as far as productivity, both in employees and sort of in the aggregate level of the government all up. And there needs to be efforts put forward to think about closing that gap and bringing these two things together. Now, government's harder to measure. We don't have a stock price. We don't necessarily have widgets that we output and sell on the open market. But we know those things work in private sector, and I think we can take some of that notional, some of those activities and apply those in a notional way to government, and assume that because they work there, they'll work here, and we can get that going and happening. In categories and things I think about here is you notice kind of in the abstract, this is a Venn diagram, these all overlap, is doing things like shifting to the cloud or consolidating data centers and all that will not only free up capital that we can spend on other things to make government more productive, but many times also get us ancillary benefits. Like a shift to a cloud-based email provider may also give you the benefit of online collaboration we're now at an inflection point through the consumerization of technology where we could seize on a new way of doing things. And so we're thinking a lot about how to go do that. The last section here, the last part of the Venn diagram is really business and citizen interaction and some of the national priorities. I work with the Job Council and think about what we can do there. We launched a couple efforts around infrastructure permits, and we're working on a one-stop shop for business. It's shame on us as a government that we, as a small business, you have to work with 7 or 8 agencies to export a product. We should have an outside looking in perspective versus an inside looking out perspective, and start to break down the complexity of interacting with the government online, in business dealings and other things. And then think about the national priorities of how do we use our investment and strength through this to help veterans, to create jobs, to do other things. And I think we have an opportunity here that we didn't have in the past to seize on this technology. Now around all of this, of course, around this entire Venn diagram, as I've mentioned, is cybersecurity. And that pressure is never greater. And throughout all of these things, across mobile, across the way we think about big infrastructure projects, the way we think about citizen and business interaction, we're going to focus on cybersecurity, think about doing that in a way. In my first 120 days, we launched a trusted identity effort to think about how do we allow citizens in a trusted and secure way to interact. I think FedRAMP holds this promise, and other things really are all in line with let's do great innovation in many things, but let's always make sure it's got a cybersecurity capability built in a way that's going to make us secure. And then, as I mentioned, not only in a dialogue with Congress and others, but thinking about driving new modes of investment, governance, and delivery. And I'll talk about some of these in a second, but thinking about multi-year funding for IT and how do we drive that, thinking about lots of things here on how do we kind of create the phenomenon and pull into this. So how do we get there? And I think you as industry partners can help us here in many ways. Number one is sort of drive this cut and invest strategy. Think about how do we do more with less? How do we go and drive savings in certain areas? Thinking about data center consolidation being kind of a CapEx motion to begin with, but lots of savings on the out years. Thinking about a shift to cloud being a shift from CapEx to OpEx and getting us lots of savings kind of across these systems. And thinking about how do we take those things from the perspective of where we do save and pour those back into smarter spending on IT across the government portfolio. We just can't have a cut and cut strategy. We can't have an invest strategy because the fiscal environment doesn't allow it because we don't have the capital to go do that. So we have to have a cut and invest strategy. Go find those savings and then invest those back into what we do. Number two is evangelizing the transformational power of technology. I think this is a job of all of us, and I want to thank ACT-IAC and the firm for inviting me here today, and I want to call on ACT-IAC and the firm to help on this point especially, which is to really talk about this transformational power of technology. I think doing events on the Hill, which I know the organization just did one, to kind of show people the art of the possible with some of this could be really incredible, and we need to be ever vigilant on this. Don't take this one for granted. If you have embraced technology in your life like I have, we often don't go out and just talk about the basics, and sometimes we have to do that in this town, so do that. We're also going to continue the great work that's happened. I think a natural motion of a person coming into a job is often to throw away the predecessor's work and start from scratch to kind of define their own brand and everything else. That's not my style. It's one where we've got a great team in place that's doing incredible work, and we're going to take that momentum and keep it going forward. Some of it will be recast, and we'll sort of turn the dial on some of it. We'll look at it, some of the things a little bit differently. I think I bring a little different perspective to the job just from my background, and I think diversity of perspective is an amazing thing. But things like the great work on Textat, the great work on cloud first, and that CapEx to OpEx shift that provides us. Data center consolidation is going to be a place where we see massive savings in the next 5 years. IT reform and 25-point plan moving there, and then focusing on open government, all under an element of reframing the way government does things. Not necessarily this team, because I think there's great proud of this work. We've hit almost every one of them. On the few that are behind schedule, it's either working with Congress to put them back on schedule because it needs congressional action, or one of them was a procurement that just slipped a little bit that's going to go through and it's on track from that perspective. And so we're really happy. Now this work doesn't end, when we check the box on all 25 of these points. We're going to continue to evolve and keep this work going and moving ever forward on many of these things and thinking about how do we focus energy on kind of a spirit of not reforming federal IT, but a spirit of continuous improvement as we move forward and think about how do we always strive to do things better than we did before. In the area of Textats, another announcement we made last week was about a year ago, we shifted the Textat effort to just be led by my team, to be led by the agencies. And one of the things we hadn't talked about publicly until last week was cost savings that came through that effort. And we were very proud to announce that agencies on their own running the Textat process. We incubated it and then deployed it across government. Drove $1 billion in cost implications across government, with many of these being the things we want to target, like eliminating duplication or terminating or reducing scope of things that were out of scope and pulling that forward. Now, what's going to happen in 2012? As we think about going forward in 2012 and sort of the themes of the next year, there's going to be a focus really across sort of four major things. One is, and many others, but these are sort of the four top ones. One is that continuation of looking at where do we get the investment capital to go invest back into IT, and that's looking at our high ROI opportunities. The cloud offers a lot of promise there, as we've talked about. Sharing across agencies, which I'll talk about in a second, data center consolidation, and lots of other things kind of fall into this category. Modular development, which I'll talk about again in a second, is another big theme we're going to look at in 2012. Focusing on 21st century government and productivity, and then of course cybersecurity are sort of the big four for us. As Mary mentioned, we last week launched FedRAMP, a new way for the federal government to not only save money, importantly, on procuring cloud-based systems, but also, and most importantly, a new way that gives us a standardized